smoke, and drink. So how much is it costing the coachmen to rebuild an entire amusement park every time they bring one of these boatloads over? Well, initially I calculated out every little piece of wood and every glass pane broken in here. But what I found out was that most of the repairs were actually just small items that ultimately didn't make that big of a difference on the bottom line. At most, we were looking at about $1,000 on tobacco, which translates to about 38 old-timey dollars, and about 200 inflation-adjusted dollars to restock the destroyed mansion with more old furniture for the boys to tear apart. Both of those numbers not nearly enough to hit the coachman's bottom line. The bigger ticket items, though, is where they get ya, namely the rides. If we're running this business, we're basically gonna need to replace the Ferris wheel cars and the entirety of the carousel, which looks like the central axis has actually been bent down the middle. This all begs a completely separate question. What kind of hell beasts are these children? I mean, what would enable them to even be able to try bending a carousel in half? And how many children did it take to accomplish that sort of thing? Or was it just one super kid? Maybe some solid steel marionette who's also on his way to becoming a real boy too. Anyway, these are the expensive things to replace. But when you actually run the numbers, they don't wind up being all that expensive. Ferris wheels are surprisingly cheap, which is honestly kind of scary to think about as you dangle 40 feet in the air on one. Smaller, used Ferris wheels cost as little as $15,000. Back in 2008, the Santa Monica Ferris wheel was put on sale on eBay for a mere $50,000. And it's worth noting that that Ferris wheel is both large and famous, which is jacking up the cost. So we're gonna assume that the coachman isn't feeling too spendy here, and we'll go with that $15,000 estimate, or 572 old-timey adjusted dollars. Still nothing that's even close to making a dent into his total profits. Now, the carousel's gonna run you a bit higher. The cheapest option is from the Carousel Works for about $320,000, or $12,000 in inflation-adjusted costs. Now, they wouldn't have to buy a whole new carousel every time so long as the turntable still worked, but from what I can tell, in carousel terms, that thing is totaled, which means that the coachman is gonna be forking out $12,000 for a new merry-go-round every time he does one of these little trips. So between the two major rides that need to be replaced with every new batch of kids, plus all the smaller incidentals I mentioned, the coachman is looking at about $13,000 worth of operating costs, which still leaves him with $146,904, or $4 million of 2018 money. But the biggest cost here is actually still coming: kidnapping the boys in the first place. The coachman has to pay low-life scum like Honest John with a big ol' sack of loot that we actually get to see. How big is it? This sack of loot is so big that it would be totally devastating to carry. I ran calculations on the amount of gold this thing holds by comparing it to the size and capacity of a standard German beer stein, which we see it lined up against in this shot. It comes out to about 1,900 cubic inches of gold, which converts to a whopping 1,211 troy ounces, or 83 pounds of gold. Don't you be forgetting about leg day, coachman. Now, this has got to be the amount of gold traded to fill the entire boat, and this, by far, is the coachman's largest expense per night, coming in at $1,631,785.93 as of writing this script. That converts to $63,179 in Pinocchio's terms. Aw, poor coachman, look at all those human trafficking profits just melting away. Now our total earnings per boatload of boys has been sliced in half, coming to about $83,725 every time, or a bit over $2 million. Now, honestly, that wouldn't be too bad of a profit for kidnapping 2,000 children and selling them off as donkeys, but we're still neglecting one huge consideration here. This whole time, we've just been assuming that Pleasure Island was just there, but the park had to be built in the first place, and building the park is going to be a huge investment for any child kidnappers to be. So let's look at the big ticket items here. First, there's the cost of that swell roller coaster. Even small steel cookie cutter roller coasters cost about $5 million up front to build, or about $190,000 in Pinocchio's time. That cost alone is more than one night could possibly earn at Pleasure Island. So we know that this isn't the coachman's first time at the rodeo. He is truly talking from experience when he says, "They never come back as boys." In order to make this business anywhere close to profitable, he's going to need more than one boatload of boys. Now add to that the cost of actually building the structures that we see on the park grounds, including walls, a giant gate, a mansion, a tower, a pool hall, slides, and suddenly the costs start growing really fast. Luckily, Pleasure Island is much smaller than most amusement parks, having only a few rides and only intending to host about 2,000 guests at a time. So we'll have to do some scaled estimates based on costs of other similarly sized parks. Luckily, we can use the recent expansion of Universal's Diagon Alley for Harry Potter Land, a project that cost a reported $400 million to make. Now, that $400 million does include $100 million for the Escape from Gringotts ride, so we'll have to knock that one off, but that still leaves us with $300 million for one small section of a theme park. Even in Pinocchio's time, that is a whopping $11.4 million. If Pleasure Island were even only the size of just that one small section of a park, there would still be a huge amount of upfront costs in creating this business, one that would take the coachmen years to recoup. So this whole thing seems busted then, right? With an upfront cost of $11.5 million between the roller coaster, the park, the other rides, the employees, $76,210 in costs every time the coachman brings in another batch and they completely trash the place, he would need to bring in 139 boatloads of small boys to Pleasure Island before he would even start to turn a profit. That translates to a whopping 292,000 children.
Oh, somebody please think of the children!
It's gotta be impossible, right? No, it's not. The coachman's main source of children during this time would have been orphans. France kept remarkable records of child abandonment in the 19th century, but they were basically the only country who did, so we'll have to work off of their numbers. France recorded about 164,000 abandoned children annually in the mid-1800s, and that's just one of many European nations the coachman and his goons could have been traveling. If Italy and Spain had even half of those numbers, the coachman could have shockingly made his money back in less than a year from only the abandoned children of 3 European countries. Going into year 2, it's actually conceivable that he could have been running the most profitable enterprise in all of Europe, while most other countries would have had no idea because they weren't even keeping records of orphans. And why? How is he able to do this? Why are there so many parentless children walking around? Because of all the wars happening in Europe during this era. Most of these orphans were children whose parents had died in the war. Those are the children that we see the coachman snatching up and reselling. In an unbelievable twist, the supply of abandoned children during this time period in this part of the world was so incredibly high that the coachman could have actually pulled off kidnapping and reselling 292,000 children, making it one of the most heinous and cold-blooded acts in history. This is the truly horrifying levels of evil that we see at play in Pinocchio, and worst of all, the coachman totally gets away with it in the movie. Old school Disney is pretty hardcore, but Pinocchio is especially brutal because in this case, we never see any kind of justice served to any of the villains in this film. In our quote-unquote good ending, the only one we see getting rescued is Pinocchio. He's the only one. All of the other 2,000 children that we see enter Pleasure Island, that we actually watch get transformed into donkeys, all of them don't escape, all of them don't have a blue fairy protecting them, all of them get sold off into the salt mines to the highest bidder, and the coachman and Honest John and Gideon are all left to run their business for another day. Just think about that next time you hear Jiminy Cricket talking about wishing upon a star. I know about 300,000 kids who'd like another crack at their wish. But hey, that's just a theory.
Wow. Just, what the hell? But, yeah, the villains never got to come up in the end. Disney had a lot of balls back then. But nowadays, it's safe in comparison. I mean, that's not to say there isn't any dark stuff. I mean, there's The Lion King. Yeah, but whatever. Just, what the hell?